The topic tonight is a discussion about the decline of Labour support in its northern heartlands. And this is a recurring theme really that's come up. It's obviously a big theme in the general election, and a lot of media reports are really playing that up, that Labour's got a problem in its northern constituencies, particularly among what's called traditional Labour voters. And it's sort of connected to this problem as well of the left behind communities and the supposed abandonment of traditional northern voters. And that's really been a big story since the referendum, and possibly before that, since the crash and austerity. And you'll all have read about Workington Man and the left behinds, and it's the question we really want to look at is this a myth, or is it actually speaking to some kind of reality? It's often framed in terms like Workington Man and Northern Brexiteers, out of touch, metropolitan elites, all of that sort of language is used. And I wonder really if we can talk about some of those questions, really asking, is that about class or is it about culture? So representations of class and regional difference may be distorted, but there are real problems, and there's real problems in the north, problems about jobs, problems about productivity, about housing, low wages. These problems are real, and they have historical roots. There's been divisions between north and south for decades, between the towns and cities and the country. But can we really still talk about traditional Labour heartlands today at a time of such fundamental political change? That's the discussion.
Can everyone hear me with this microphone? Is it?
Probably need that
this one. Right, okay. So thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause first of all for Pauline for organising tonight's event. I used to be described on these occasions as an academic, and then it became an academic and a politician. Now it seems to be a politician and an academic. So I think now I've gone over to the dark side. There's probably no way back, really. Yes, as Pauline was saying, I was a very active member and committed member of the Labour Party. I did invest a lot of time and effort into the Labour Party as a councillor, as a branch and constituency chair. I didn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn in the leadership contest, but he won that fair and square, so I tried to make that work. But then when the Brexit, the decision was taken to have the referendum on continuing membership of the European Union, and I've always been what I would describe perhaps as a never an enthusiastic pro-European or a Eurosceptic, but a Euro-realist or Euro-pragmatist. What my old politics professor Jim Bullpitt used to say were the sort of people who were sitting around waiting for Godot, waiting for some kind of inspiration or something to happen. Godot arrived in the form of the referendum, and so people like me had to make a mind up. And initially, I went to a speech that Gordon Brown gave in Liverpool, which was meant to kickstart the Remain campaign, and the whole thing was so thoroughly depressing. They said, we're not in the Schengen area, we're not in the single currency, we just carry on as we are. And of course, the Remain campaign was entirely negative, it was entirely based around fear, and so I started to look more closely at the levers and found that their arguments chimed with me, and the response from colleagues in the Labour Party who had previously got on with, people who had campaigned with every week when there was a candidate, as Pauline mentioned, over in Yorkshire, with comments, you'll never be a candidate for us again. Well, that proved to be right. And very dismissive, very contemptuous of anyone who voted Leave, and ever since, all the language, I've heard this repeatedly in academia, it has to be said, but also in the Labour Party, is they were stupid, they were racist, they're xenophobes, they were tricked, they were conned, there was a lie on the side of a bus, they were all duped by it. There must be a second referendum because now the slow learners have been able to catch up, so they'll agree with us. Sheer contempt in the Labour Party for working class voters. And bear in mind that in the referendum, 64% of the C2DEs, the working class, voted to leave, 36% remain. And then, in the 2017 election, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that Labour's biggest gains were amongst the middle class, an increase of 12%, and the Conservative biggest gains were amongst the working class, 12%. I mean, Labour still had a lead, but it was cut to 4%. And I suspect that one of the things that's going to happen at this election, I don't want it to happen, but I think it's going to happen, is that the Conservatives may well take the lead amongst working class voters for the first time. We saw it a bit in, I'm not suggesting that Liverpool Riverside is suddenly going to become a Conservative seat. People vote habitually, Conservative and Labour. But bit by bit, I think things are changing. So we saw in the last election, Stoke South, a solidly working class Leave constituency voted Conservative for the first time. Canterbury, for instance, voted for the Labour Party, of course. There's a huge cultural disconnect between Labour Party activists who have complete disdain, in my experience, not all of them, obviously, but the majority, I think, complete disdain for working class voters, a huge cultural disconnect. As I said, class voting has become more blurred than it has been before. Age is now a much more important factor. Education, cultural values are a much more important factor. What David Goodhart would call the somewheres and the anywheres, and the Labour Party increasingly, in my experience, represents the anywhere. So I left the Labour Party, and initially I was going to just take a back seat. I was going to go, give up with politics or electoral party politics. And then I found the SDP initially on, cause they were very active on social media, and I got more involved and realised that they represented my values. Now, I'm not suggesting there's going to be an electoral breakthrough anytime soon for the SDP, if only there was. I did a hustings in Warrington South yesterday, and the question was, would you ever break the whip? And I said, well, what a wonderful situation that would be if there was an SDP grouping in Parliament to be able to break the whip, But I think gradually things are changing. And this is not a change which I welcome, because the Labour Party was historically, of course, born out of the working class movement. The Labour Party always understood that the working class was small c Conservative. Yes, it wanted properly funded welfare services, wanted a fairer economy and so on, but it was quietly patriotic. And I'm afraid now there is a shadow foreign secretary who sneers at anyone who demonstrates patriotism for England. It wants, it's not racist, but it wants immigration controls, and there's a shadow Home Secretary who appears to want no immigration controls at all. And the Labour Party is completely disconnected. And I'm not, it's not an anti-Corbyn point. I think it's probably got worse under Corbyn. But also New Labour, with its kind of global cosmopolitanism, was very different from the working class roots at all. I mean, remember, Attlee had a quiet patriotism. Ernie Bevin said we must have the atomic bomb with the bloody Union Jack on top of it. Hugh Gateskill said that joining the EC would be the end of 1,000 years of history. Peter Shaw, in writing a biography about at the moment, certainly understood the patriotism of the British and particularly the English working class. And I'm afraid, the last sentence, I'm afraid the Labour Party has completely lost that. And one of the final comments that was made to me when I was clearly going to leave the party, or thinking of leaving the party, is don't worry, they said, the Blairites will be back in charge soon. Well, this wasn't going to convince me to stay. In fact, I said, well, if that's the case, I'm leaving straight away. The Blairites and the Corbynites have unfortunately lost touch with the working class. And the Conservative Party, of course, isn't going to represent the material interests of the working class. So I'm afraid it's a very sad situation where the working class are probably for the first time going to vote more for the Conservatives than they are for the Labour Party. And despite the 9 years of austerity that has so impacted on the working class. So I'm afraid that the final note is a rather pessimistic one.
Right. Thank you. Barry, thanks.
Okay, number 2 in this gang of 4. I had a very different journey through into the Labour Party, because I actually came back into the Labour Party in 2010-11 because I absolutely knew what was coming. As soon as the Tories got into power again, with the help of the Lib Dems, and the first thing they did within 2 months was to take £6 billion out of the public sector. You just knew that we were going to have the same kind of attack on the public sector, on public services, on poorer communities, on cities than we had during the Thatcher period that we had to endure in the 80s. So for me, the only option for me to do anything about that is something, because I've always been I was a member many years ago. I've always been a Labour voter. So the only option for me was to be in the Labour Party. So, are people abandoning the Labour Party, or is the Labour Party changing and reflecting the social, demographic, economic changes in the country? I suppose I don't know. I suppose none of us really know, do we? And we could have said that probably in 2017, except after years of a sort of a declining vote for the 2 main parties through the period of the Blair and the Brown governments through into the coalition, all of a sudden in 2017 we returned really solidly at the time to a 2-party election. Both parties poll 40, 41, 42, 3%. So would you have said in 2017 that the Labour Party had abandoned its working class areas or its traditional areas where traditionally Labour got its vote? You probably would have, on reflection, have said no. And of course, the press and the people who are speculating and talking and digesting and reporting and commenting on politics, I've got a particular view of it, because they always think that politics has taken the same course through 2010 and onwards than it had done in the previous 60, 70, 80 years. But of course, what changed was the financial crisis. Interesting, Kevin, that you mentioned austerity in passing at the end of what you were saying. But that has caused it just dropped. It dropped a bomb of absolute total economic senselessness right into the middle of our social politic, in the middle of our communities, in the middle of how people think about their politics and thinking about whether politics works for them or not, and created utter confusion, which I think partly, I would think, explains Kevin's move to the SDP. But as a Brexit supporting, as a person, but I remember when Trump got elected, my feeling was you can never underestimate the contempt that the electorate will hold politicians in if they don't start thinking, speaking, reflecting the issues that they are experiencing themselves. And I was going to say that from the 1980s, there's probably 3 things in terms of drift, in terms of politics and social change, is that following the 1980s and 90s of 18 years of Conservative government, there was decline in a lot of our cities and towns, particularly up in the north. And I'm speaking from Liverpool, which is always a bit of an outlier. and probably worth saying that I can't remember, and I don't know when this has happened, that there's been a Labour government and a Labour council. So Liverpool's always does something a bit counterintuitively, but it left a decline in those cities, and Liverpool was somewhere where the Tories clearly wanted to write off, as it did a lot of the northern towns that it knew it wasn't interested in because it couldn't get a vote. And then when New Labour came in, I think for all the talk of regeneration, and it was in 1997, after 18 years of grinding Tory rule for a generation, it was a joy to have something different and conversations that were completely different about what might be possible. But and then there was that sort of the sort of more, the sort of the people that were, some of the people that came in to represent some of those towns. Peter Mandelson, who legend has it confused mushy peas and avocados when it was guacamole in Hartlepool. And other MPs who got targeted and planted into particular places. A couple of them have been in Liverpool, have they not? During that period where people were willing to suspend their disbelief because they thought there was going to be real change, at the end of it, I think when the crash happened, the financial crash, started to think, well, what have they done for us? If you go to Stoke, and if you look, and I was going to look at Grimsby, and I'd be interested to hear what Mo says about the northeast. You wonder, well, where's the benefit been from those communities of having either Labour councils or Labour government? And when they've not been represented by people who feel that speaking their language, that doesn't mean they have to talk with a particular accent, but just to understand the issues that they've got. I don't think that's a surprise when you start to feel that people started to say things like in the 2015 election that you're all the same. And I don't think whether you're Labour, whether you're Tory, that was a quite a common view. And I thought my understanding of that was that they didn't mean you're all the same because your policies are the same. I think what they meant was you're the same because you're not really saying what you believe, and we know that you're not. So, when Labour from 2010 to 2015 was denying an alternative to austerity, that was unwilling to stand up to a narrative that put austerity, the financial crash, purely at the foot of the Labour government when it was an international banking crisis, but was unwilling to challenge that. The cost of that was not so much politically, because of course it was. The cost of that were people's terms and conditions of employment. We had a huge growth of 0 hours and agency contracts. There's been no pay increases in the public sector. There have been other increases in prices as privatisation started to have its true and proper impact on people's household income and their expenditure. And I think people were starting to think, but what you're saying doesn't chime with what I think I know you believe, but also what I'm experiencing myself. And I think that's what they meant then. So I think what is important, and it's funny, it's probably, I'm going to contradict myself in a minute, but I think in 2017 people wanted a bit of authenticity. And I think Jeremy's election was about that. Now, whatever Jeremy stands for, he doesn't stand for, and I voted for him twice, is that authentic, is an authentic, honest voice as a decent person. And I think that is what, particularly in 2017, people really want. And actually, I think people really want that now. Except that they will quite happily, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, but people seem to be quite happy. People know that I was going to call him Trump, but Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, to give him his full title, is a liar. They know he's got no integrity. And they know that, and people will vote for him anyway. So there's that kind of a bit of a mixture here between a bit of authenticity and people thinking this contempt that there is for, for politics. And then, of course, that has been fueled by what's happened by Brexit. And I've been on the doorstep the last couple of weeks, and there are people who've been Labour voters as well, actually, in Southport. And they're saying, oh, you haven't got Brexit done, I'm not interested, all I want is Brexit, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, 3 years ago, before there was a referendum, which was an internal battle between the Tory party, that was led, the Remain camp was led by the Tories, the Brexit camp was led by the Tories. So were you the slightest bit interested in Brexit in Europe? And they went, no. So, but now it's become like a huge issue. And I think, for me, it's about what austerity has done with the social change that there's been in the country, with the conditions that people are having to face with their own personal, individualised experiences that's happening because of the breakdown in large industrial workplaces and complexes that there are in the country. We've individualised our politics as well as our workplaces. And I think within that confusion, there's a volatility. And so I don't know whether we've lost our heartlands or not. But what I do know is that we have to speak with authenticity. We have to understand in a language, in a way that understands the experiences that people are going through themselves, to be able to represent them in the right way and have an impact, therefore, as politicians in their own lives. Otherwise, people won't feel that politics works for them. And I think there's a lot of people who don't really feel that. And I think that's a much bigger issue than this one.
Thanks, Barry.
Do you mind if I sit down? It's just my eyesight's going a bit crazy. I'll try and keep looking up. So that's really interesting what Barry was saying there, because of course the big thing that's happened within the Labour Party between 2017 and now is that they have pretty much firmly committed themselves to becoming a Remain party. I know they have a Brexit policy. Yes, is that better? Yeah. So what I was saying is the big change between 2017 and 2019 within the Labour Party is that they've pretty much firmly committed themselves as a party of Remain. And when we have these discussions about whether or not Labour has lost its heartlands, its traditional heartlands, northern particularly, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it? We're talking about the fact that 70% of Labour constituencies voted Leave. We're talking about 73% of Leavers who say that they will vote for the Tories. And the 18 consecutive polls have put the Tory leads in double digits, although if anybody's been paying close attention, that seems to have changed a little bit this week. So we may see, as we've seen in other elections, a kind of resurgence of that Labour vote. But I didn't want to talk so much about the upcoming election, more the debate that's happening in society around the election. So the pundits tell us that the election is going to be won or lost on 3 issues: Brexit, the NHS, and the cost of living, austerity, life being hard for people. Those are the 3 issues. But I think there's a 4th issue, and to me it cuts across all of those, and it's probably more important, and that's the issue of trust. Everybody's talking about who do you trust? Who do you trust to deliver Brexit or to stop Brexit? Who do you trust on the NHS? Who do you trust with the economy? Trust it features in the question time, audience questions to the panels, the leaders' debates, and so on. And also, who do you trust more, Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson? And just as I was leaving the office tonight, there were 2 Twitter trends trending. One was Labour Lies, which is about trust, and the other one was about, I think it's about the Andrew Neil interview, Boris the Coward, apparently he's not going to do that. Again, this is about trust, isn't it? Whether or not somebody's brave enough to face the public. So trust's a big thing. Now, I know Twitter isn't real life, but it is interesting because if you talk to people in the Labour heartlands in the northeast where I live, and some parts of the northwest where I've been working recently, working class people are saying that they trust Boris Johnson more than they trust Jeremy Corbyn. Now, this could seem completely mad, depending on your politics. I'm sure Barry does think it's completely mad. And I think even the most ardent Boris supporters knows he can be, shall we say, economical with the truth from time to time. But what is fascinating for me is that trust isn't a policy. It's a virtue. It's a value. It's something we either do possess trustworthiness or not. Now, it's very clear to Leave voters like myself, and probably quite a lot of Remain voters too, that what that Brexit vote did, because let's face it, we haven't Brexited yet. We haven't Brexited yet. What that Brexit vote of 2016 did was to bring the political class of this country almost to its knees, I would argue. We had a summer, in fact, since about March the 29th, we had a summer of madness. We had party splits. We had Supreme Court decisions bringing the executive and the judiciary into loggerheads. And we had some atrocious behaviour in the House of Commons. We had, if anybody's a kind of current affairs junkie like me, we had these really unedifying scenes on kind of, do you remember on Parliament Square where they kind of do the films and you got interviewing politicians there. You had Tory against Tory, Labour against Labour, Tory against Labour. I mean, it was completely unedifying. And do you want to answer that? So for me, that Brexit vote really tore back the curtain. It was that Wizard of Oz moment where we looked at our political class and we saw that it was wanting. It wasn't able to do what we thought it could do. Whether that was to prevent Brexit or to enact Brexit, it just seemed completely unable to do that. And this comes hard on the heels of the Brexit vote itself, which was apparently, many would say, 2 fingers up to the establishment. So trust in this establishment, in this country, in both parties, is really at an all-time low. And I think this is at the heart of the issue for Labour. I think the Tories as a party are going to be okay? There's been some suggestions that they might have to face off the challenge from populism, from the Brexit Party and all the rest of it. They seem to have contained that for the time being anyway. They're the longest established party. Just as well I know you don't.
It's given us a bit of direction.
Well, if the
I'm worried that you're saying to
well, if we can't trust the political establishment, we can trust our sat-navs, can't we? Where was I? Yeah, they are the longest established party. They've got plenty of wealthy donors. They are the party of the world class. I think they're going to keep it together for now. But what about the Labour Party? Because if we're dealing with a trust issue, while voters are looking at a virtue or a set of values, I think Labour is in trouble because its values have changed. When I first began getting involved in left-wing politics, one of the things that people always said about the left is that it valued self-determination. That was the point of the left, that you built a working-class movement who were seeking for self-determination, not to be ruled over, but to kind of take control of their own lives. I think, and I believe that's why that Brexit, that Leave campaign, Take Back Control, meant so much to people. I don't just believe that, I've heard people say that as well. But over the last 30 years or so, certainly since Blair, the values of the Labour Party are not the same as those of the Labour Heartlands. Kevin's already talked about Emily Thornberry mocking the guy with the white van with his flags outside. If you're a blue-collar worker who goes to work in a white-collar van and has a terrace house similar to that photograph she pointed to, maybe your brother's in the armed forces and happy to fly the flag for Britain, that really is out of sync with how working-class people feel today. Even Labour Party activists who are prominent in the media don't seem to believe in the Labour Heartlands anymore. For instance, in an article for The Guardian not long after the referendum in 2016, Paul Mason said this: "The Labour Heartland is now in the big cities, among the salaried class and among the globally orientated, educated part of the workforce." And he's really been pushing this point ever since. So it may not be a problem for the Labour Party in terms of votes. They may be able to get those city votes, those metropolitan votes, those kind of left-wing academic-y votes. But it is a problem for the left-behind communities, because who is representing them? Are either of the two main political parties really representing working-class people? I don't think they are. So what happens next? I mean, my guess is one of two things. We might find this out in the general election. They will cease to want and expect political representation and we'll just go back to kind of technocratic governance as usual, or a new party, a new third party, as well as fourth party, Lib Dems, I suppose, might emerge. That might be the Brexit Party. The Brexit Party are certainly very popular in a lot of Labour heartlands, or it might be the SDP. I just can't see it being the Labour Party, because the party of Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, Attlee, Shaw, Ben, it's no longer that party anymore. And as far as I can see, Labour's heart is no longer with its heartlands. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Can everyone hear me okay? I've got a bit of a cough, so I apologise. So I had about 15 minutes of material prepared, so I'm gonna keep it to 5 minutes. Don't worry. I think the first thing to say is just how timely this conversation is. So, in The Guardian today, we saw the headline: Labour to focus on Brexit-backing voters in final fortnight. And this comes from the YouGov poll yesterday, and obviously there's lots of reasons to mistrust all sorts of polls, and perhaps particularly YouGov, which showed that in London, 52% of those polled were leaning towards Labour, but in the north it was only 39%, in Scotland 13%, in Midlands and Wales 30%, and in the rest of the south 27%. I mean, the age statistics are also very, very striking. So I think this is really the first thing to say, is that this debate is really central to the discourse around this election. So I guess what I really want to talk about, though, is how we got to this situation. So we've got the third general election in 4 years. We have a state of profound political crisis. And I think it's quite extraordinary that we are going to the polls again. Don't worry, I'm not saying there's too much politics. This is a bad thing, but I think it is quite remarkable. So, I mean, I think that the longer-term structural transformation of British politics has to be put into the context of particularly two things. The first of those is, and a lot of this analysis comes from, sorry to give a plug here, from the Full Brexit. If you haven't heard of us, go on the website. There's lots of articles putting it more eloquently than I can now. But this first point is what is EU membership? What does it actually mean? Well, I think even today, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what EU membership really means. So on the Eurosceptic right, you have this idea that the European Union is a superstate, is crushing the sovereignty of all of the member states, and importantly, member states, not nation states. And then on the left, on the kind of Euro skeptic left, maybe there's this idea that it's a capitalist club, it only defends the interests of capitalist powers, and I agree with that to a certain extent. And then on the Europhilic left, you have this idea that it's incredibly some defender of workers' rights, the European Union. I think this is not the case. But I think really the meaning of European Union membership is to be found in the effect that it has on domestic national politics. So it's not about what the European Union is, it's about the effect that it has on British politics. And so the context in which we entered the European Union, in which the European Union's our membership, the effect of it has been felt, is this context of, I guess, a deep and a widening disconnect between political parties and voters. So in the post-war period, and particularly accelerating from the 70s onwards, you see a decline of associative activities such as party membership rates falling, voting rates falling, church attendance, trade union membership, and this is an incredible gap that comes to exist because these institutions which previously mediated between the people and the state no longer exist. So I think this has a number of really important consequences, but one of them is that, and you see this in the politics of the last few years very strikingly, that there's no material force to ideas like accountability, think of Chakramana, or majoritarianism. I mean, look at the Labor Manifesto for some really good points. Where does it start? It starts with the Green Industrial Revolution. Brexit is right at the back. It starts with this idea of we have climate change as a motivating thing to get us to act politically. There's no idea of saying, well, actually, we want to have a project that can mobilise the whole of society behind it. So I think this context of the defeat of the left in the 80s and this widening gap, this is the context in which European Union membership comes in. And this, I think, is part of the reason why we still, as Mo put it, we still haven't Brexited yet. We've had this vote, but there isn't that connection that was previously there between people and the parties to enable us to essentially hold our parliamentarians to account. So I think that's a really, to keep to 5 minutes, that's a really potted history of some of the key points I think it's important to bring out here, because that's the context in which this Labour Heartlands decline, as I said, very timely debate happens. But just briefly to put it into international context, because I think it's not just in the UK where the left is really struggling to connect with the working class. So in America, there's a absolutely fantastic sociologist, Jennifer Silver, who wrote a book, We're Still Here, Pain and Politics at the Heart of America. Definitely recommend checking it out. And it's a very, very rich book. I can't do it justice here, but the most interesting interview, and this is just around the time of the 2016 presidential election, she speaks to somebody who says, well, and completely no illusions about politics, has a very, very clear understanding, a working class respondent, and says, well, you know, at the end of the day, I'd rather have President Dickhead than President Sellout. And that is, I think, such an encapsulation of the problem that's currently facing the Democratic Party, because they fielded Hillary Clinton in 2016, this unbelievably unpopular candidate, and I don't think they've learned the lessons of that defeat. But we'll see what happens with Bernie Sanders potentially in 2020. And then at the same time as this happening in the Anglosphere, in France you have obviously an extremely problematic relationship between the people and the representative institutions. The Socialist Party in France, which is the Social Democratic Party, along the same lines as Labour, has virtually evaporated. And this is true of almost all social democratic parties in Europe. Labour's the exception, and I think there's some interesting reasons potentially why. Maybe Corbyn is part of this. The Corbyn surge in membership is really interesting. But I think when we take this kind of wider perspective, potentially it reveals, or it suggests, in my opinion, quite strongly that you have this situation of declining mass participation in politics, which happens from the 1970s onwards, the defeat of the organised left in the 80s, and then in 2016, suddenly you have these purely accidental factors in the UK which lead to a massive repoliticisation. Brexit, I think, is that moment that could have been a real potentially mobilising. It was a democratic moment without a democratic movement, and I think Labour is partly involved in this, partly to blame. To put not to put too fine a point on it, but yeah, I think this is the sort of a really important bit of context that this re-entry of democratic politics into a situation where the institutions which previously mobilised and catalysed it leads to a whole set of debates and conversations around things like the Labour Heartlands. Anyway, I think I've gone over by 1 minute, so I apologise. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to what I think is going to be an absolutely cracking discussion. So thanks.
Okay, thanks. We'll take some questions, I think, from the floor. I think there's like some... It's interesting because there's a sort of mixture of optimism, because you've got the surge, you've got the surge around Corbyn, and you've got a kind of a sense that things in Britain in particular might be not as pessimistic as they are elsewhere. And certainly I get the feeling that this election is actually quite exciting. I mean, you were talking about 2010, and that was such a boring election. Even though it was really serious, it just had this crash. It was so boring to choose between David Cameron and I forget, Nick Clegg, you know. So Clegg Mania was the most exciting thing. So I think it's strange, it's a mixture of things. We are in really exciting times when it seems there is a surge of interest, and the Labour Party is definitely buoying up on that. It's not suffering the decline of the Socialist Party in France at all, and certainly not in Liverpool. So there's a mixed bag here, and yeah, let's take some questions then from the floor. Put your glasses on so I can see. You got your hand up straight away. It's Kevin.
This is a question for everybody, because I think nobody defined what the Labour heartlands are. They used a phrase. Do you mean simply areas where there is a strong Labour vote, or are you using some sort of subjective category? Because I've lived in a number of Labour heartlands. I'm afraid they vary considerably, and I'll allow you to make your own definitions of that. But as a rider, slightly unfair for two people possibly, but for Barry and Kevin not. Does Liverpool constitute a Labour heartland? In other words, do the models that at least two or three of you have put forward apply to Liverpool? And if they don't, why don't they? Why don't they also apply to other Labour heartlands such as Manchester and parts of Newcastle? In other words, I think we need to define our terms. I think the idea of the heartland it's an American term, and it's actually pretty meaningless in the British context.
One of the things I tend to think about politics at the moment is that it's not really about left and right. It's more about this kind of collapse of globalisation and sort of like a breakdown of hegemony for what, and I'm not that knowledgeable, but you will be. It's almost like a breakdown of hegemony from the centre, and this kind of like technocratic breakdown of government and trust in institutions. And I was wondering, do you think that the left just doesn't know how to respond to that? It doesn't know how to invent its own form of populism, but the right is kind of finding a way to do that, and that's where the real problem is. They're too tied into globalisation.
So I'm from Bolton, Liverpool. It's a very working class background. A lot of my friends are into politics, and they have no sort of interest in it whatsoever. And I feel, why is that disconnect between people who it affects, especially austerity, the most? Why do they have this complete disdain for politics in general? Generally voting numbers are so low across the country. If it affects people so much, and you mentioned before about an exciting election, then why are the numbers so low? Why do people so feel so not part of the whole thing in general? I just don't know why it is myself.
Ex-teacher, I've education background. What I'm interested in is that none of you seem to mention the media, the influence that's gone on, the fact that we're told this narrative constantly through things like Twitter, but most of the people I know, most of the people who I represented in education, like this gentleman said, have no interest, no engagement, no agency in local or national politics, and yet somehow we've arrived at a small majority that have voted to make this massive decision that they never talked about before, and yet suddenly are told they must leave Europe. It strikes me as odd that there's a lot of talk of cheating that's gone on, the American influence, and I think, how big do you think that is in influence of what has happened? And I don't mean in people's lives daily, I just mean in this media bubble, this story that we all seem to be glued to. My family, people I know, they're not engaged with it. If you ask them if they ever mentioned leaving Europe, if they ever knew anything about Europe prior to 2016, they'd say no, and they would still say they don't know much about it. So I just wonder, how much are we being manipulated? What do you think about that, this whole thing?
That's great. I'm going to take one more. It's a good point. Can I take one more from?
Yeah, I've got to respond to that woman there. I mean, seriously, what you're saying basically is so disdainful of ordinary people, and it reflects on what this chap here's just said. You were saying that ordinary people sort of have no voice, they don't respond. We've just had the biggest ever mandate that we've ever had in this country on a fundamental, the most fundamental political issue we've ever faced, a binary question. And frankly, I find really insulting. You may be a teacher. Let me finish.
No, I'm going to interrupt and say that my question was never posed any disdain.
Well, I think it's extremely disdainful, because what you're basically saying is you are capable of sifting through the media, you are capable of understanding, but ordinary people aren't, because we're not engaged, we're not connected. That's what's underneath everything you say. It's absolutely disgraceful.
I've got that, and I've got your point there. Now, and thank you both for the points there, because it's great, and that's what we want. We want argument, and we want debate, and it's brilliant. But I'm going to take it back, if you don't mind.
Okay, I just want to dispel a bit of a myth here. Labour hasn't lost its values now. It lost its values at the end of the 1990s and the end of the last Labour government. Otherwise, how was it that a Labour government got elected in 1997 with 43% of the vote, but left government with a vote of 29% in 2010? I'll ask you that. So that was because Labour lost its direction and lost its sense of values through, someone mentioned globalisation, about this issue, this political tool of triangulating. So it's kind of responding to a question by thinking about, first of all, what you might want to know, and then thinking what somebody else might want to hear you might say in a response to that question, and kind of formulating it in between and coming up with some kind of an answer. And people by 2010 and by 2015 got mightily fed up with that. They got mightily fed up with that. So I think in 2017, the Labour Party polled more votes than it had done since 1997. So I'm not accepting the argument that Labour has lost its values. I'm not accepting that. I think Labour has returned to its values and a sense of authenticity, and that's what attracted people, I think, in 2017. And just in response to the media, I think you're absolutely right. The issue of trust is a media question, and this is boiling down quite complex issues to very simple, banal questions about, do you believe him or do you believe him? And I don't think the politics has got anything to do with that. I really don't. I think it's got to do with the fact that people generally want to feel, what I said before, is politics working for people? Do people in politics represent and trying to do something about the things that bother me most? So I really don't accept a lot of the argument, because I think it, and of course, and the last thing I would say is, of course everyone's going to say that, because at a time when there is quite, I don't think it's that radical an agenda. If you look at Harold Wilson's manifesto, it's much more radical than this manifesto, for example. But are we surprised that a potential left-wing government might come in on the back of a very good election last time, that it's subject to incredible storm of criticism, whipping up all kinds of narratives to try and create the impression that it doesn't represent anybody, that it's lost touch with everything? I just think I'm not buying that. I don't think that is it. I think austerity and in the middle of a period of industrial decline has created that volatility within and a contempt within people who want to vote for someone that listens and understands what they are saying, is really more what this is about. And that's just the same as Brexit. So I think those things for me are much more important. The rest of all those kind of things, I find, and I would argue, are fairly superficial.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Can people come back? Because I've got people wanting to come back.
Yeah, sure. So the media, I work in the media quite a bit. It enjoys a narrative. It's a good story, what they call a news cycle. They're kind of quite lazy. They enjoy these cycles, and one thing leads to another. So absolutely there are narratives in the media. I think it's quite interesting because the media has been solidly remain all the way through, and that's what makes a mockery of this idea that people just sap up information from the media. The tabloids and some of the right-wing newspapers backed Leave, but the idea that our mainstream media didn't back Remain is just bonkers, and yet we still voted Leave. Interestingly, the BBC don't like Corbyn either very much, I would say. So they're in this very strange situation where they don't like Brexit and they don't like Corbyn. And, it's quite fun trying to watch them kind of work themselves out on that. But we're working these things out as well. And I think the guy who talked about globalisation and the end of left and right kind of hit the nail on the head here. Because the Labour Party emerged in the 19th century because of the urban proletariat, the working class that were kind of moving into the cities and who developed this sense of agency and wanted a vote and wanted to influence their working conditions and their housing conditions and all the rest of it. The Labour Party was really formed through capitalism. Without industrial capitalism, the Labour Party wouldn't have existed. And now we are moving out of a kind of we're in a post-industrial capitalist kind of period, into much more where globalisation, our economy has become much more, I mean, globalisation's been around since the 19th century, but we do live in a kind of free market, globalised world, and we are working these things out. The terms left and right started in the French Revolution. They don't really make much sense to us now. So this gentleman and this lady having an argument here, this is us as a society working out what we think of the new economy and the new kind of conditions, economic and social conditions that we find ourselves in, and the politics is working itself around that, I think. Interestingly, there's this argument, why do people have a disdain for politics? It's because I don't think the politicians have quite caught up yet with what a seismic shift is happening kind of globally. I love George's phrase, we had a democratic moment in 2016 without a democratic movement. And I do wish the left had got hold of that democratic movement a bit more. We are having democratic moments all over the globe at the moment, from Hong Kong to the Gilets jaunes to places in South America. The whole world is kind of redefining itself at the minute. That's a bit epic and a bit kind of philosophical, but I think this is really important, and we're probably not going to get to the heart of it until the historians from the 25th century are looking back and analysing us more then.
Anyone else want to come back here?
Yeah.
Okay, George, we're going to do it, and then Kevin, and then I'm going to go out again.
Yeah, really fantastic set of questions. Maybe just to come back on the Labour Heartlands defined terms. I'm not sure it's necessarily the best phrase either. I think if Labour does have a Heartlands, does have a class fraction that it's representing, its public sector workers, and I think this idea of Labour Heartlands is probably to a great extent an artefact of the media representation of the working class. You have journalists bravely leaving the Guardian office to come north to speak to people with different accents, and that's what it often is related to. Yes, I mean, maybe we should treat it with caution. And just to go back to Kevin's earlier point, that this election could be a class realignment election to the extent, in the sense that the Tories might get more working class votes. So that's definitely something that's at stake in this election. The point about the breakdown of hegemony, and I think this is really important. What was the left's response to the financial crash, the crisis in 2008 and onwards? I mean, this is really striking how left populist movements across Europe seem to have floundered, and mainly because they are not prepared to take on the European Union. They're not prepared to say, okay, we need rupture. If we want to break from neoliberalism, we need to break from the single market. We need to break from the customs union, and this is a very serious political project. And I don't think the hard work has been done for a variety of reasons across Europe to actually engage in that fight. The point about disdain for politics, I think this is another really great question. I think it's partly because politics is disconnected and has been disconnected for a long time from people's day-to-day lives. One way of putting this is that socialism traditionally has been focused on two things. One, the working class as an object, i.e. improving welfare, improving material conditions, but at the same time, working class as subjects, so working class as as everybody in society collectively self-governing, feeling the power of our vote and feeling the power that we have to change society. And if you don't have that second one, as radical as your manifesto can be, or could be, if you're trying to go through a second referendum, that isn't a route to socialism. And that isn't a way that you're going to... Thanks, one person clapping is all... I believe it, though. I believe it. Everyone else can clap later. And just finally on this point on the media, I think trust is a material issue. It's not a... And what do I mean by that? I mean, I think if you look at the way in which politics is structured and that kind of gap that I mentioned earlier, that's why there's a lack of trust, because politicians don't feel themselves to be accountable to us. So why do they need to do things that we trust them, that enable us to trust them? I think there is a material reason for this. But yeah.
And Kevin, come back and then I'll go back out.
Yeah, okay. So in answer to Kevin's question, I mean, I was just taking Heartlands to mean the safe Labour seats, the ones which, it mentioned Stoke before, Stoke South, and this year it could be Stoke Central and Stoke North that have never changed before, but they might change now. And the reason I said before that I don't think Liverpool is going to change. I think Liverpool is different because of the Irish migration, because historically the main social division wasn't social class but religion and so on. So I think there's always been a feeling that Liverpool, culture, mentality in Liverpool, and it's different from the rest of the UK. But I simply meant Heartlands. I took Heartlands to mean the safe Labour seats. I was thinking about it electorally, but also I think it reflects a cultural thing. So the safe Labour seats are working class seats, they're poorer seats, and there is that working class culture in those seats. So I think the culture and the politics and the electoral politics go together. In terms of media bias, well, it depends which media you talk about. So in terms of the newspapers, yes, I accept most of the newspapers are right-wing, but I would say the BBC is where most people get their news from. Newspaper circulations are going down. The BBC, I would say, has a very Remain bias, not necessarily a right-wing bias or a left-wing bias, but I think it's a very liberal. Well, it is a liberal bias. I think in terms of the BBC, and a very strong Remain bias, and you see that in terms of the panels on the makeup of panels on Question Time. The comments that people have made, like Humphreys and so on after he left the BBC, and academic surveys of the BBC as well. The ideological spectrum question, I think, was the most interesting. I was asked yesterday I did a hustings at Priestley College in Warrington, and I think all they did was manage to confuse the students, because I was speaking to some of them afterwards, and they said, well, are you left wing or are you right wing? Because on some things you seem to be siding with Labour, and on some things you seem to be siding with the Conservatives. And I think the reason for that confusion is because the left-right spectrum is essentially about economics. So, in Warrington, the Green pulled out in favour of the Liberal Democrat, a Remain alliance. The Brexit Party candidate seems to have given up. So the hustings are usually the Labour guy, all men, unfortunately. But the Labour guy, the Tory guy, they constantly try to just argue and bicker amongst themselves. The Lib Dem and myself, and although the Lib Dem and myself and the SDP would probably say they're in the centre, I seem to disagree most with the Lib Dem guy, and I think the reason for that is because there's also a vertical axis which is cultural. So the left-right axis is essentially about economics, but there's the vertical axis, and I think the other three, I think the thing is the other three, the Liberal, the Tory and the Labour candidates are all on the Liberal or Libertarian scale, and I think that's the difference with the SDP. And so on some things I seem to be very old-fashioned and traditionalist. And I think that cultural distinction is important, because I think in working class communities there is that communitarian culture. There is a belief in that it's not all about individualism and rights and cosmopolitan culture and so on. That it is about morality and a quiet sense, as I said before, a quiet sense of patriotism, not an aggressive nationalism, but a quiet sense of patriotism. I think those values are still held in working class communities, and none of the other parties speak to those values, which is why I think that in working class communities there's a sense that no one represents them, and I think that leads to the apathy, and that's compounded by as this gentleman was saying here, about the response to Brexit, that they're all stupid and ignorant and racist, and they couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the issue, and they should never have been trusted with it because it's just too difficult for them. And if you have that for 3.5 years, as you do, then you can see why working class communities are, why they are disconnected.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So I was the loading clapper. I clap on the do. No, because your point was really important. It was about agency, and I was kind of trying to think about, how I understood this process, because I don't think that, the Labour Party losing support from their traditional voters is really about geography. I'm surprised nobody mentioned George Orwell. The North-South divide has been a point of discussion for a very long time. I don't think it's necessarily about geography, except in the sense of cities versus everywhere else, small towns and rural communities. But I think the process has been going on a long time. It isn't a recent thing. It isn't since 2008. It isn't since 2017. It's been since the 1970s or 80s that the Labour Party has been losing its traditional support. I know that from my own family that's happened, and we're not Northerners, right? But it's happened through, I think, globalisation and deindustrialisation of the areas where traditional Labour voters lived. So in South Wales and in the Northwest and the Northeast, the heavily industrial areas where working class people belonged to unions and supported the Labour Party. They had in their community Labour Party clubs where they would spend their social time. All of those kind of community organisations of unions and labour clubs, are kind of gradually dissipated, and people don't have that kind of community connection anymore to the Labour Party. So that's kind of eroded. That's part of it. But as I said, it's a process. So I'm trying to work out how it's going on, so that this divide that you're talking about between the leadership or the MPs don't come out of those union movements. They don't come out of the community labour groups anymore. They're generally kind of career politicians, and they don't have that kind of connection or background. It's becoming a very kind of narrow sense of the background they're coming from think tanks or lawyers or whatever, professional class. And in the Labour Party, and that's particularly under Blair. So the way that they politically responded to globalisation, deindustrialisation, is that Blair said that we have to be, I have put this quote down because it's very interesting, it was actually mentioned today on the radio, swift to adapt, slow to complain. And that's how the Labour Party wanted the working class to be, right? This is under Blair. And so we need to adapt, we need to be kind of open to global change and all of that. It was very liberal. Now I do think that Corbyn changed things. There had to be a change, something happened. It started with Miliband, right, who tried to kind of bring back some of these values. But if you look at the way that some of the Labour MPs, so Emily Thornberry's already been mentioned, but the one that really struck me, and I began to understand this much better, was when Gordon Brown called that bigoted woman who had spoken to him about immigration. This was a concern which the Labour Party didn't want to engage with. They didn't want to talk about. They just wanted to call working class people bigots for thinking that immigration was a problem. And so Gordon Brown smiled and shook her hand and got in the car and called the woman a bigot. And the resentment, they don't even understand the resentment that creates amongst working class people. That they don't take their concerns seriously, that they just call them names in response, and that isn't going to get their support. So I think it's been drifting away for a long time. In the 1980s, actually, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on why is the Labour Party losing working class support, right? So this is not a new question. This is a process that's been going on, and I think that Brexit has really been kind of the icing on the cake, if you like, because just like with the bigoted question, they don't understand. I mean, there's a real sense of disorientation. Like they don't understand, the MPs don't understand why working class people voted to leave in such large numbers. And I just...
I'm going to have to stop you in a minute.
Okay, I'm nearly finished.
Yeah.
This is my final point. Just want to say a couple of statistics because they're quite shocking, or you know, they really shook things up. So in Blackpool, 67.5% of people voters voted to leave. Right, in Burnley it's 66%, in Blackburn 56%, in Preston 53%, in St Helens 58% to leave, whereas Liverpool was 58% to remain. So there is that divide between the cities and the small towns or countryside. And so I think that, I'm just coming back to the initial point about agency, is I think that the Labour Party is now about not recognising the agency of working class people, but somehow kind of pitying them or acting like, oh, we've got to, you know, help all these people who have been damaged by austerity. And that isn't what working class people want. They don't want to be pitied and looked down on and given food banks, right? They want jobs, obviously, but they also want some kind of self-respect and sense of they are being listened to and their voice is being listened to. And the reason that this announcement today about focusing on the North isn't going to work is that because of what's happened with the Labour Party over this whole period of time, working class voters in these heartlands, you know, that's probably not the right word for it, don't trust the Labour Party more, which is the point that Mo was making about trust being so important, but it's been eroded over a long period of time. Anyway, your responses to that, I'm sorry it was so long.
I think the vote in the Labour heartlands has changed over the years because the trade unions have finished, the industries have finished, and it was always about protecting the trade unions and workers' terms and conditions, so all that's changed. What I'm asking is, do you think the politics in the future is moving towards personality rather than policy? After the war, you had Clement Attlee, there was no personality at all. Then there wasn't a great personality really, I suppose, until Thatcher, and then it was Blair, and then it was Bland again, and then it was Corbyn and Johnson have come along. Do you think that people no longer actually listen to what's being said? They're just listening to how it's done, how it's presented in the social media, on the BBC, whatever, you know, how you smear each other, how you ruin each other. The question is, how do you think future politics are going to move?
Yes, and apologies for my phone earlier. I'm just wondering if, rather than the decline of the Labour heartlands, it's actually the Labour Party, which was the creation of the working class, was the biggest mistake that the working class ever made, because what it did was hand over and control it, subcontracted. It said, we want people to represent us and just get on with it. And for a long time the trade union movement was much stronger because the connection, as we've described, through work and in communities was real, and who you voted for and who you elected for was tied up with the debate. It wasn't just about, we'll vote for you, you get on with it. There was the back and forth, and that has gone. And I don't think 25 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, I would have dreamed to say that the trade union movement was now, like the Labour Party, part of the establishment, but I would say that now, and I think that has come home to people. And so I think that's what the decline is. The working class still exists, we are still the mass, but what we have to do, as has been said, we have to find our means of taking control again. We didn't succeed in the past. We thought the Labour Party would do it for us. We now have to find another way. So it's a massive job in front of us, really. But we're starting it, I think. So I think it's up, not down.
I'll keep this one super quick, right? I spent a lot of time in local politics around the Labour Party, and the question I'd like to ask you is, do you think people actually understand the institutions of local government? Because I don't think they do at all. And second question is, do you think left-wing politics has really become well-paid jobs for middle-class people to fix the poor, which comes to the agency kind of thing?
Brilliant, thanks very much. That was nice and quick there.
I actually enjoyed what Mo had to say, so I'll sort of leave you out to this. But I think the other three panel members sort of epitomise the problem we've got today, that there's no working class representation that really means anything. I mean, people are talking about the working class in a patronising way of the old ways, but here we are today when the working class has made its stamp on society like never before in the vote to leave. That is undeniable. Now, Kevin, you're in the SDP. The SDP position at the minute is to accept Boris Johnson's treaty. That's your policy, that is a Remain document, it's a Remain treaty, it's against the people's vote to leave. So how you can sit there and talk with any sincerity about representing the working class, I'm absolutely stunned. I think it's disgusting. George, you're on the left. You're part of the full Brexit. You consider yourself almost as a pressure group of the left outside the Labour Party. Lee Jones, one of your leading academics, has recently written a paper where he has outright said to accept Boris Johnson's treaty. He's tried to, in a convoluted and intellectual way, intellectualise out of it. The truth is, your position is to accept Johnson's treaty. That is in no way respecting the working class vote to leave. And I have to say, Barry, you epitomise, I think, the problem, the big problem here tonight. You're clearly a good working class guy who's worked his backside off. You clearly believe in the working class. You do the stuff, but you're deluded politically. I'm sorry. You say today that the referendum result is not that important compared to all this. You said it's not that important compared to other social issues. It epitomises the misunderstanding that not just the Corbynista middle class people in London don't understand the working class. You clearly don't understand the working class that voted to leave. You are in a Remain party. You are doing work on the streets today for a Remain party. It is anti-democratic to Remain. We voted to lead in a democratic vote. You are in a Remain party and you really need to do some soul searching, because you cannot in any way or form represent the working class while you support being in the EU and supporting the capitalist class represented by undemocratic bureaucrats in the EU. You really need to do some thinking.
Okay. One more person, I'm not sure, but anyway, that lady there, definitely, thank you for that.
Well, like this lady said at the back, before I was asked to vote on Brexit, I'd never really considered it. It wasn't a burning issue for me. What the EU was the burning issue. But once I was asked to vote, I thought about it. Now, I looked at what had happened in Greece, I looked at what was going on in Spain, and I thought it was a thoroughly undemocratic institution, and I wanted to leave it. Now, other people, working class people, voted for the reasons that they thought. A lot of them wanted to take back control, or whatever other reason they voted for. Like Kevin said at the front, I think that Corbyn, the Labour Party, had a moment of authenticity when Corbyn was elected. They thought he might be something new. In 2017, the Labour Party said it would recognise and respect the Leave vote. Since 2017, it has campaigned against the Leave vote and vilified working class people who voted for it. The contempt on Channel 4 News, Emily Maitlis, the contempt that anybody that voted Leave, as if we've all got 6 toes and 3 heads, has been palpable for years. So how you can say that we've been brainwashed?
I asked a question. You need to understand. I asked the question
because
the question is sitting there. Don't tell me what I think, and certainly don't tell me I have disdain for my people, because I certainly don't.
You keep putting words in people's mouths. You never said that you're stupid or anything like that. So why do you say
the notion that people didn't know.
Can I just ask one question, please?
One moment. Can
I just ask one question? Can I ask a question?
Can I just ask if we could address the questions to the whole room so everyone can take part?
They're using templates. Stop talking.
1 minute.
minute.
You said
1
templates
minute,
that
and then
we
you can
see
speak.
all the time in the national
1 minute,
newspapers.
and then you can speak. That lady there, do you want to finish your point? Do you want to finish your point off, and then you can say your point, and then I'm going to come back to the panel.
You've been talking to this lady here, and you've
Address
not been addressing anyone.
Address your point.
So my last point is that working class people knew what they were voting for. They've been treated as if they don't know what they were voting for, and there's a real disconnect between the Labour Party and its traditional base.
You're getting the last word, so there you go.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, all I can say is I'm Labour. I'm genuinely Labour. I've been working class all my life. And what I'd like just to ask every single person in this room, just to tell me, because I've never been told by anyone yet, what the hell leaving Europe will do for me or you. Because I know the fishermen have a problem, I realise that, and I realise also they could be given a grant to get over that particular problem. But in my naivety, I have no idea what leaving the EU will do for me or you or the UK or jobs or the economy. And we have a fella here who looks like he's a plan from Question Time or something. I don't know what the heck. He said to me earlier, we've literally just, we've passed through, and he said to me, I'm doing the same. And I'm thinking, oh my God, we've got a plant here from Question Time. People who don't talk with any emotion or feeling or genuality. And that's what I'm puzzled by the whole damn thing about Brexit. And I tell you what it is for Labour. It's the unsolvable problem, because Labour is massive. There's loads of Labour voters, loads of Leavers, loads of Remainers for whatever they think, and it's an unsolvable problem, because if Labour say we're Remain, the rest are going to go mad. If the others say we're Brexit, the rest are going to go mad. It's almost like the best conspiracy for the Tory party. And the Tory party are the people who are destroying jobs and destroying the UK right now. And the whole country is sleeping. It's all talking nonsense about this and that. And that is the big picture of what's going on. But please, just to finish, please, will someone tell me how the hell leaving the EU will help me or help you in your lives? Just answer that one question right now.
Right, I'll tell you what, thank you, you got the last word from the floor. I will come back to you because it's kind of going to be your last word. So shall we come back starting in the reverse order and start with you, George, and work our way down the table?
Yeah, some really good questions. I think the point at the end, and maybe the point against the full Brexit, full Brexit is not a party. We don't have a unified position. I don't happen to agree with Lee on that point, but I think those two maybe we can continue the discussion over a beer, because those conversations would take far too long for me to just summarise now. Just in kind of concluding words, I mean, I've been in a strange position that I have been in professional and social situations where people have assumed that I'm a Remainer, and the amount of condescension has been absolutely extraordinary towards people who voted Leave, and I think that is not the basis of any sort of left-wing politics, to see your fellow citizens in that way. And I'm not saying that anybody's comments from the floor did that, but I think that it does illustrate that the British left is in a really dangerous position. And there's a phrase of the political theorist Richard Tux that I really like, that there's a tendency to see the state as the armed wing of Oxfam. And this goes to the excellent longer point at the beginning, which is that, okay, we need to help people, and this is the most urgent thing, and so we need to do something about it, but it's all about charity. It's not about agency, and it's not about empowering, and it's not about and mobilising people politically. So yeah, I think just to sort of sum up on all of this, I think Tony Benn's point that you start with establishing democracy first, and then the socialist policies come. That's why I've been a member of the Labour Party until relatively recently, and Momentum. But I think for me, there has to be a line in the sand beyond which you can't support Labour anymore. And for me personally, that was crossed with its approach to Brexit.
Right, how to cover all of this. One of the things I really don't like is that graph. Kevin, you mentioned that graph and it's all about economics and left and right is economics. I don't think that's true. Do you know the one I mean? Authoritarian, libertarian, left, right. It's starting to define. I hear students now talking about you must be left-wing because you like the state, you must be right-wing because you like the free market. It's not entirely true. Remember, the Labour Party didn't start off with demands for a welfare state. It wasn't until the mid-30s that these things started to come along. It was much more about, as I said earlier, self-determination and working class people being able to do things for themselves and being freed from oppression. And if you listen to Maurice Glassman on this subject, he's far more eloquent than I am. But we've now got to a situation where in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher declared there is no alternative to the market. Soviet Union collapsing. There's nothing left. We've just got free market globalization. And the left kind of didn't know what to do with that. And so we've really seen this idea now that capitalism is just evil. There's no alternative to it. Therefore, we have to build up a very strong state to protect people from the economy, which we have no control over. I mean, this is kind of nonsense. The economy is simply a collection of all our collective activities. It's not some kind of amorphous thing. It's not spiritual. We have control over the economy and we have control over our politics and we have control over our lives. The problem is pretty much since, but I do think since we've joined the European Union, politics has been taken behind that curtain. We don't see what's going on. We can't hold these people to account. That, together with the two-party system in the United Kingdom and these safe seats and the way the constituency have come across, it's no wonder we've now seen what was a very interesting European election turn into a very kind of ordinary two-party, two-horse race that we've seen since Parliament began. Actually, if you have a look, as I did the other night, because I'm such a geek, the two parties kind of dominate. So I don't think it is just about economics. Nobody was prepared to riot on the streets when Northern Rock in my area collapsed. Nobody was prepared when the financial crash, when we bailed out the bankers. Nobody was taking arms against the state then, but very close. We came in this country to people coming to the streets when their vote was about to be overturned and when Brexit was about to be failed to be to be enacted, and yet might not be. So I think this idea that it's the economy, stupid, that everything is down to people, to austerity, and that's all we have to do. Actually, people want to be part of their lives. People say there's no such thing as agency. Perhaps that's because politics has been hidden for them for so long, and it's about time we kind of really rip that curtain off and kind of really put accountability back on the table.
I think these are two generalised comments to make. I just think that as if these things are new, because they're not. And I think, and somebody has sort of mentioned some of those things before. Where your trade unionists were seen as being part of the establishment. When they didn't want to. When there's been calls for general strikes and they haven't wanted to do that, or other strikes during in periods in the 1980s and other periods in our history when trade union leaders haven't necessarily represented what their workers might want to do. So I think that argument has been around for a long time, and I'm not arguing from a nutty lefty let's get out and have a general strike all the time point of view, but I just think that that's an issue that has been around for since politics has been around. I think that just to answer your question, do I think most people understand the institutions of local government? No, I don't think they do. And generally, and I'll give you a reason why I think that is. Do left-wing people get into politics and other institutions because they get an income out of it to try and sort poverty out for people who are struggling? Well, some do, of course they do, but I wouldn't want to label everybody for that. There's some good, genuine people around. But no, I mean, I know what you mean. No, yeah, no, I know what you mean. I think, and I think there has been I think there has been a period of time, and I think through the last Labour government where, there were people who got careers out of this and politics, and some of that, I think you could genuinely, level that against them. Just very briefly, I think that one of the reasons why people don't understand the institutions of local government is because the decisions that local government can take have been reduced significantly. And when you consider that most people's relationship with the state, if you like, is either through the NHS or through what local government does, when local government doesn't have those kind of responsibilities because they've either been outsourced or they're being dealt with by other organisations that aren't local councils, you have organisations that with health and education and others which don't have any level of democratic accountability anymore. So I don't think it would be unfair to say to people that they don't understand the institutions of local government or what local government, for example, can do, because those things have become, over years, have been degraded from levels of, from what local government should really be about, which is democratic accountability, for those services that people experience. That's my view. Am I deluded? Yeah, probably I'm deluded. I'm a politician. I'm joined the Labour Party, but I'm not. Listen, I'm the only person on this table who voted Remain, by the way, and.
No, you don't know that now.
Is that right? And I'm not. And I'm not getting into this to sort of have an argument about Remain and Brexit, but I think what I meant to say when I said it, I think you took it the wrong way. It's not important. But what I want to say is these things and these drifts in politics and the social change didn't just start in 2015, 2016. These are issues that have been around and bubbling for a long time. And things and politics goes through these different dynamics. And we lived through, those of us who didn't like it and lived through the Tory governments from 1970 through the 80s and thought there could never be any end to that. These things somehow managed to change, and they did, and I think that they will change again. It's just that Brexit is such a powerful force in the way that we want to talk about issues to do with politics, that it dominates, and as it has done tonight, all those other issues. And we will, I'm sure that we will probably end up, leaving the European Union in whatever way that we have. But unfortunately for me, where my eye is, that people are still going to be on 0 hours contracts. People are still, we're still going to have a situation where our public services are underfunded. We're still going to have a situation where we haven't discussed how we deliver public services in a modern world. We're still going to have a situation where people are experiencing problems. Everton has been one of the areas of highest levels of child deprivation 30, 40 years ago, and it still is today. So these issues are still going to be around, even though Brexit might be sorted out, which is maybe your sort of issue at the back there. And for me, we're going to have to deal with that. And I don't know what will happen next. I don't know what's going to happen in this election. And working class people have never voted one way as a bloc ever. I mean, there were a lot of people, working class people, who voted Tory in the 1980s. They must have done, otherwise Thatcher wouldn't have got re-elected. So I think that has always, those things have kind of always happened. But I've come back to what I said before, politics, and I think this is why Brexit is such a powerful issue, is that people want to see politics working. And if they don't see politics working, when at the end of the day, most people aren't really interested in politics. Most people aren't interested and get involved in the day-to-day things, really, until they feel they really have to. And when they feel they have to over something like, Brexit, and whatever people, Remain, Brexit, whatever people is motivating people to vote in that way, is an incredibly powerful drive. And it's the same drive, I think, and I'm not saying it because I'm being pejorative. I'm not saying, but I think what happened with in America with Trump has pushed one way, and I think it will push another way in the next election from the same base, by the way. And I think the same things will happen here. This story hasn't ended yet. And I think where Labour sits and where all the different political parties sit in terms of relation to who's voted for them traditionally in the past is an issue that will carry on. And I don't know where it will go. I know what I'm going to be fighting for, but I'm not sure where it's going to go. But it hasn't ended, and it won't end with this election. But at the end of the day, I just come back to what I said before. Politics, people feel when they get to a point where they're so fed up and pissed off with what's been going on over the last 10, 12, whatever many years, they want to feel that what they're listening to, what people are saying, actually addresses that or recognises something in what people are actually feeling. And that's what surely politics has got to be about, so that it actually can be seen for people, to work for people and in their best interest. I think the Labour Party is a way that will do that. And I think whether we were successful in this election or not, it isn't going away, and things will change. And let's see what happens as this moves along to its next phase.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay, I mean, it's great that it's such a lively discussion. It's a bit late in the night to sort of reopen the whole Brexit thing. I'm quite happy to talk to the chap here who accused me of betraying the working class, and also the chap at the back about what on earth, what benefits there are of Brexit. I'm quite happy to have a chat with you both after. Although I have to say, one of my former students is here who's now just obtained his PhD, and my priority, with no disrespect to either of you, will be to buy him a celebratory drink, actually. Someone mentioned before about Gordon Brown's gaffe in the 2010 election. Everyone knew that Gordon Brown was going to make a gaffe, the poor guy. Everyone was waiting for it. But it was more than just a gaffe. I mean, it did reveal the cultural disconnect between, in that case, the Labour Party leader. If you listen to that whole interview, Gillian Duffy hardly said anything about immigration. What she said was quite mild and moderate, really. And yet, as soon as he gets in the car and thought the microphone was off, he called her, that bigoted woman. I mean, that incident really did reveal the cultural disconnect that I started off talking about this evening. I think, Barry said that the Labour Party has rediscovered its roots. I think it has in terms of, economic and social policy. It's rediscovered, the need for an active state. And Maurice Glasman was mentioned before. I've sparred with Maurice in the past. I'm afraid he got it wrong with his Blue Labour thing, which was strong on the nation but weak on the state. And Corbynite Labour is strong on the state but it's weak on the nation. And you've got to have both the nation and the state. I mean, Morris's view is, and I'm paraphrasing but only slightly, the high watermark of the Labour movement was the 1889 London dock workers' strike. And everything was all right until 1945, and it was downhill all the way after that. He said this to me. I mean, all of the great achievements of the Labour movement have been, I mean, it was great, no doubt, for those who worked in the London docks, the benefits that they got from the 1889 strike. But you've got to have the state. The most of the achievements of the working class in Britain, most of their progress has been through Labour governments implementing things through central and local government. So it's good that we've rediscovered that. I was calling for a long time for a more radical economic and welfare policy. But unfortunately, the Labour Party is in the same position culturally, sneering at the working class, like Gordon Brown did with that Gillian Duffy incident, and sneering at the working class because of their leave propensities. So you've got to rediscover, if you like, the nation, a quiet, as I said, not an aggressive nationalism, but a quiet patriotism, and the active state.
Right. Well, thanks very much, and thank you to our speakers. I think they deserve another big round of applause.